Have you ever imagined what leads a child to sit every day on the sidewalk of a school, even without having the right to study there? While dozens of students enter with full backpacks and distracted faces, she remains outside, her eyes fixed on the classroom window and her heart full of a desire that many ignore to learn. She had no notebook, no uniform, no one for her, but there was something that no one could take away, the thirst for knowledge. Every word that slipped through the crack in the window was like a treasure for that orphaned girl of only 10 years old. And even though she was invisible to so many, she insisted on coming back. Every day. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt ignored, even screaming silently for a chance? Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and get ready to experience a story that begins outside. That sidewalk was always the same, rough, hot in the summer, cold on cold days, but for her it was the closest place she could get to a dream. Every morning, even before the bell rang, the girl was already there. He had no backpack, no uniform, much less a colorful lunchbox like the other children. Her bare feet, her hair tied up with a worn elastic band, and the dress she wore every day seemed not to belong in that scenario, but she was always there, sitting right in front of the main gate of the school. It was a private school, one of those imposing ones with large windows, a well-kept garden and a facade that seemed to shine under the sun. Children arrived in cars with tinted windows, some jumping in a hurry, others being carried by nannies. They laughed, talked, held their tablets or new books, complained about the cold, the heat, or another day of school. No one looked at the girl who was sitting across the street. For many, she was just part of the scenario, invisible, silent, insignificant. But inside her, the world was boiling. When the classroom windows opened, she could hear fragments of explanations, teachers, voices, questions being asked and answers appearing in the air. And it was as if each word absorbed became a small brick building, something big inside his heart. She didn't have a notebook, but she wrote it down mentally. I had nowhere to practice, but I memorized formulas, phrases, ideas. What others considered routine for her was privilege. That orphaned girl, only 10 years old, had found a place of hope on the sidewalk. No one knew his name. She was neither a student nor a visitor. It was not on the roll call, nor at the parents' meetings. The gate never opened for her. Even so, every day he returned to the same point at the same time, as if he belonged to that place. The employees noticed his presence but never approached. Some pretended not to see, others shook their heads in disapproval, but she didn't care. What he wanted was not food, nor charity. I wanted to listen, learn, to understand what was behind. Those voices that spoke of the world, of numbers, of letters, of things that she did not yet know, but wanted to know. Time passed slowly for her. While the students counted the minutes for recess, she counted the seconds of silence between one sentence and another, to try to capture everything more clearly. I had learned to read the lips of some teachers. She knew that the man in the brown suit spoke too fast, that the biology teacher gesticulated a lot, and that the math teacher liked to repeat the same thing 3 times. That was how she was building her own method of study, sitting on the street outside, away from everything that brought her closer to a better future. Sometimes a ball would escape from the yard and roll close to it. The girl returned carefully, with a shy smile. The children, however, almost never reciprocated. Some laughed at her, others whispered. There were those who called her beggar, or just the girl on the ground. And even when someone dropped a piece of paper or a piece of bread near her, it wasn't out of kindness, it was out of disdain. But she didn't react. He didn't complain, he didn't cry in front of anyone. He just watched with that insistent sparkle in his eyes, as if he saw more than what the world offered. The sound of the school bell was the highlight of his day. Not because the students left, but because it was break time, and she could hear the teachers' conversations in the courtyard. He learned new words, discovered stories, expanded his vocabulary without having to open a book. It was a simple, repetitive, and for many even absurd routine, but for her it was what kept alive a flame that no one else saw. On a cloudy afternoon, while waiting for class to start, the girl noticed that someone was staring at her from inside the building. A woman with her hair tied up, a serious expression and discreet clothes. He didn't seem to judge her, but he didn't smile either. For the first time he felt something different. Someone was not just seeing, he was seeing. But that moment lasted only a few seconds. The window was closed and the class continued. The girl took a deep breath, as she always did, settled on the corner of the sidewalk and stayed there with what was left of dignity and faith. The week passed. The girl continued her routine, even with rain, even with the strong wind. And the image of that woman was still alive in his mind. Something was different. There was a discomfort in the air, a restlessness that she could not explain, as if the silence around him was about to be broken. If you felt this story touch you so far, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? With each new day, the routine of that orphaned girl repeated itself like a silent ritual. She arrived before the first backpacks got out of the cars, even before the school doors opened. He always chose the same corner of the sidewalk, a stretch where he could see part of the window of the second-year classroom, and there he sat with his legs crossed, as if that piece of concrete were his own school bench. The ground was hard, and the sun wasn't always kind, but none of that made her retreat. What really hurt was not the discomfort of the body, but the indifference with which she was treated. Many saw it, but few actually looked. Some students pointed and laughed, muffled, as if it were a ready-made joke. They called her the street girl, the one who has no school, the weird one. Sometimes they mocked her faded dress or her disheveled hair, as if the lack of a comb was a cause for shame. She did. Every word, every laugh. And even when she kept her head down, trying to pretend she didn't care, something inside her broke, silently. But he did not give up. What he carried in his eyes was stronger than any mockery. Adults also saw her, of course. Cleaning workers pushed their carts of products right next to her, always looking sideways, suspicious. They never asked his name, nor where he came from. Fathers and mothers passed with their children by the hand, speeding up the pace when they noticed her presence, as if she represented a threat, an error in the system. Some changed sidewalks, others whispered with expressions full of judgment. This girl should be somewhere else, they said, in looks that spoke more than words. But no one sent her away, maybe because they didn't know what to do with that persistent presence, maybe because deep down they felt a discomfort that they preferred to ignore. She, however, continued. Every day, sun, rain, wind, in silence, as someone who carries within himself an urgency that the world refuses to see. It was as if that sidewalk was the only space where it could exist, where, even ignored, she could still dream. And he dreamed. She dreamed of a blackboard just for her, with a pencil sharpened, with a name on the call. She dreamed of a teacher, calling for her, with an empty desk waiting for her. He dreamed mainly of a future in which studying was not a privilege, but a right. And while she couldn't have any of that, she fed on what she had, the words she heard from afar. Once a girl, her age passed by her, and threw an empty packet of cookies right next to her. Nor was it carelessness, it was contempt. The package hit the girl's leg, who looked at it, picked it up gently, and threw it in the nearest trash can. He didn't say anything. He didn't react. He just returned to his seat. Those who saw it laughed. But she didn't. That was already part of everyday life. There was no more room for hurt, only resistance. Even so, there were times when loneliness tightened my chest, in which the sound of other people's laughter hurt more than any words. When she saw her classmates hugging each other on birthdays, eating cake on the patio, exchanging stickers and secrets in the hallways, she felt a pang of absence. Not only because I wasn't part of it, but because I never was. I didn't know that kind of affection, routine, belonging, and even without knowing the name of it, I missed it. It was as if the world existed in vibrant colors on the other side of the gate, and she was trapped in a black and white film, watching life happen without being able to enter the scene. Still, the girl was faithful to her ritual. Every morning, he would get up with what little he had, a torn blanket and his courage intact, and walk to school like someone going to a temple. because for her, that place was sacred. Every sentence he heard, every new word he learned was like a gift hidden among the noises of the day. And even if the eyes around her didn't see her, she took it all in like a sponge thirsty for knowledge. There were days when I thought about giving up, when the cold was stronger than hope, or when hunger made her belly growl louder than the whispers of the rooms. But it was enough to hear the voice of a teacher enthusiastically explaining anything, even if she didn't understand it at first, to remember why she was there. Because deep down she knew knowledge was the only key capable of opening doors for someone like her, and if that was all he could achieve for now, then he would hold on with all his might. On an overcast morning, the girl noticed that some looks began to be repeated. People who had not even bothered to notice her presence before were now watching her at a glance with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance, maybe because of the time she was already there, maybe because her constancy was more disturbing than her absence. But no one said anything. Silence was still the most common response, and yet there was something in the air that looked different, a discomfort that surrounded her, as if his presence, previously ignored, began to weigh down, as if, suddenly, his persistence gained volume, and that in a way changed everything, because when the silence starts to bother, it's a sign that something is about to be broken. And she, sitting on the same sidewalk as always, with the same watchful eye and the same worn clothes, seemed to feel it on her skin. At that moment, even without knowing it, she was getting closer and closer to a moment that would change not only her routine, but her entire life. That morning arrived like so many others. The sky was still painted light grey when the girl appeared, with the same firm steps, the same clothes washed in the stream from the previous week, and that look that never wavered, even in the face of everyday contempt. It was almost routine to sit in the corner of the wall, lean your back against the railing and wait for the sound of the first voices inside the school. It was there on that boundary between the world inside and the world outside that she felt she existed, neither fully included nor completely expelled, just there. But that day something seemed to be out of place. There were no screams around. Him, no mocking laughter. The footsteps were quieter, the conversations between the employees more discreet, as if something was about to happen, although no one knew for sure what. And she, who learned to read the environment as someone who learns to spell between the lines of life, felt this change in the air. Still, he remained in his place, the body immobile but the soul alert, as always. The hours began to pass as if dragging chains. The girl struggled to hear what came from the nearest window, where, at that moment, a geography lesson seemed to be taking place. The teacher talked about countries, borders, and names of places that she would not know how to locate even if she had a map in hand. But she memorized every word. He repeated it mentally, building his own universe inside a brain that, although small for some, carried an immensity of dreams. It was then that he noticed the movement. The main gate, which rarely opened during class time, was unlocked with a slight metallic crack. From inside it came a woman with firm steps, a serene countenance, and eyes that seemed to weigh every detail in front of her. She wore discreet clothes, a bun tied with elegance, and a look that did not get lost in superficialities. She was the director of the school, a figure that until then seemed to belong to an unreachable dimension. Always seen from afar between walls and glass, she now crossed the garden and walked slowly towards the street. The girl didn't know how to react. It was not common for anyone to come to her, much less a figure like that. His first instinct was to lower his gaze, hold his breath and shrink a little more, as if expecting a scolding, an order to leave, perhaps even a threat that the police would be called. That's how they usually treated people like her, as a nuisance, a mistake, a mess, out of place. But the woman did not stop inside. She walked through the gate, walked to the sidewalk and stood there right in front of the girl. Her presence carried no fury or coldness. It was a different silence, almost welcoming, and for a brief instant, an instant so subtle that it could go unnoticed, the girl allowed herself to look up. And when he did, he found a look that did not judge, did not question, did not condemn. It was a curious but calm look, as if to say, "I see you." There was no agitation, no uproar. Everything took place in an almost poetic slowness. A restrained gesture, but one that would change absolutely everything. The woman just bent down a little and remained there at the girl's height, as if she didn't want to scare her. She asked something, and the girl hesitantly answered in a few words. He didn't have to say much. What was stamped on her face was enough: a thirst to learn, a tiredness of fighting, a fear of being expelled once again. It was at that moment so simple and at the same time so gigantic that something broke. An invisible barrier that separated worlds began to crumble. The principal stood up, held out her hand firmly and pointed to the open gate. There was no imposition, just an invitation. And in the face of so many looks that always crossed her as if she didn't exist, that gesture was like a silent hug, a mute declaration that, finally, someone believed in her. The girl hesitated for a second. I felt my heart beating too loudly. Her eyes filled with water, but she held on. He took a deep breath and with short steps followed the woman to the gate. The world seemed to have stopped. Students in the courtyard watched from the railing, some gaping, others confused. Employees whispered in the corners. It was as if no one really knew what was happening. After all, no one had ever seen anything like it there. As he entered, his feet touched a different ground. Clean, shiny floor, smell of soap and chalk. The corridor was long and bright. Pictures on the walls, motivational phrases, images of achievements of award-winning students. Everything there seemed too new, too clean, too unreachable. But she was inside. For the first time, there were no bars between her and knowledge. For the first time, she was not just a spectator. It was part of the scenery, even if I didn't know what it meant yet. The sound of footsteps echoed between the walls like a melody of conquest. The director guided her with serenity, without haste, as if she knows exactly where everything should. He did not ask for documents, nor where the girl's parents were. At that moment, none of this seemed to matter. What there was a decision, to give it a chance. And that in itself was already a revolutionary act. As they walked through the corridors, some doors opened. Looks appeared in the cracks, trying to understand that unusual scene. A student without a uniform, no backpack, no name on the list. That broke all the rules of the standard, all the silent norms that defined who belonged and who didn't belong to that place. But no one dared to interfere, because the director's silence was more powerful than any argument. And so, in a simple walk, the girl crossed not only the school gate, but an invisible boundary that separated her life from what she had never dared to imagine could be possible. His body was still shaking, his heart still doubted. But the eyes did not lie. They shone like never before. Because now, for the first time, she wasn't just listening from the sidelines, she was inside. And that changed everything. The doors kept opening. The sound of the girl's footsteps echoing down the corridor seemed to blend with the fast pace of her own heart. Each step she took inside the school was like a new beat of something that was born inside her. Not fear, not doubt, but a silent force that she did not yet know how to name. For the first time, she stepped into an environment where everything seemed too clean, too organized, too sophisticated. A world that he had always observed from a distance and that now opened up, right before his eyes. Even though her body shuddered with the cold of insecurity, there was something in her eyes that remained steadfast, the same glow that had sustained her for so many days outside. The principal led her to a classroom at the end of the hallway. Inside, children his age laughed, talked, and some stared at the blackboard as if it were just another ordinary day. But that day, for her, was anything but ordinary. It was a divider, a tear in time, a turning point that only those who have had everything denied can recognize. As soon as he entered, he felt the gazes turn in his direction. They were not welcoming looks, nor were they kind. They were expressions full of strangeness, with a hint of judgment that hurt even without a single word said. The clothes he wore were completely out of step with the clothes of his classmates. It was not uniform, it was not new, it was not washed with perfumed products. It was just what she had, her hair tied up as she could, her hands sweaty and restless. There was no backpack on his back, no pencil in his hands. There was only her, and the absurd courage to be there, facing a world that until then had only dared to dream from afar. He sat down in a vacant chair at the back of the room, indicated with a silent nod. The bench was hard. The table had pen marks and scribbles from other students. For her it was a throne, an altar, a privilege that only those who have been cold and hungry truly understand. At that first moment, I didn't know very well what to do. The words on the board seemed scrambled. Math left her confused. She didn't know how to hold the pencil in the right way. I didn't know when to raise my hand, when to shut up. I didn't know how to act, but he knew how to listen. And listening was something he mastered with mastery. I observed every gesture of the teacher, every movement of my classmates, every glance crossed between the explanations. His attention was absolute. He drank from each piece of information as if he were drinking the only drop of water available. In the desert, during the break she sat in the same place. The children ran into the courtyard, and she stood there quietly, as if she feared that when she left someone would notice that she was there by mistake, as if he felt that if he crossed the door, all that would disappear. And maybe it would disappear, because most of the voices she heard were of rejection. Students' whispers, evil smiles. It was as if they were saying, with their eyes, that she didn't belong there. Some passed by him covering their noses, others pointed, mocking. Their clothes, their worn shoes, their embarrassed silence. But she remained. He did not react, he did not answer. He just looked at the board, as if choosing where he wants to put his energy. The next day when he arrived, he found something unexpected on his desk. A notebook. It was used, the sheets had already been partially filled, and the cover was torn. But there was a blue pen attached with an elastic band. No dedication, no note, just the notebook. No one took the gesture, but she understood the message as a vote of confidence. She picked it up gently, as if holding a gift too valuable to be wasted. From that moment on, he began to write down everything he could remember, every word said by the teacher, every number on the board, every sentence explained. It was as if his memory finally found a concrete extension. And she gave herself to that act with a hunger greater than the one she felt in her stomach. The days were accumulating, and with them, the obstacles. He was still the target of cruel comments. Some children walked away when she passed. Teachers, even without malice, looked on with restrained curiosity, as if they were always trying to understand what she was doing there. But there was an essential difference between being on the outside and being on the inside. Now she had a voice. There was paper. There was space. And as narrow as this space was, she filled it with the strength of someone who spent her whole life being pushed to the edges. Over time, he learned to use the pencil firmly. He began to understand the exercises, to solve simple problems, to build complete sentences. With each small achievement, he felt within him a silent explosion of joy, one of those that are not shown with screams, but with shining eyes, and the heart beating faster. Even when he made mistakes, he did not give up. And that was what caught the attention of those who really paid attention. The way he insisted on learning, how he fought against each difficulty as if he were fighting a personal battle against forgetting, against the destiny that others had traced for her. There were days when he arrived without eating, others in which body aches almost prevented her from getting up from the makeshift bed where she slept, but none of that stopped her. There was something about that classroom that was more important than any comfort. It was the place where he felt his life was beginning to make sense, where his existence ceased to be a shadow and became a presence. She was still not seen with affection. By everyone, she was still the target of rejection. But for the first time, he was inside the frame. It was part of the landscape. She didn't talk much. His shyness was a shield and protection. But he spoke with his eyes, with the gesture of writing everything down, with a straight posture, with unbreakable attention. Gradually, some children began to notice, not with admiration, not yet, but with a certain surprise. After all, how could that girl who didn't even know how to write properly now be able to answer the questions before them? How could someone who seemed to have come out of the streets understand the story as if he had been there from the beginning? And as time went on, she became more than just the new girl. She became the one who got good grades, the one who discreetly helped colleagues, the one who stayed in the room after class to review the content, the one who read the books in the library as if they were diamonds. It was impossible to ignore it completely, even though many still tried, because there was something in her presence that could no longer be erased. She was there. And as much as they couldn't explain how, it seemed that she always belonged there. The white slate left erased marks that she tried to decipher. The scribbled pages of the other notebooks served as inspiration. The teacher's explanations, which once seemed like a foreign language, were now beginning to make sense. It was as if, little by little, she was finding a key to open the door to a universe that she had always believed to be locked to her. And this key, she discovered day after day, had been inside her forever. She just needed someone who believed enough to allow her to use it. The weeks were shaping a new version of that girl. Firmer, more attentive, safer. But inside there were still open wounds, the marks of rejection, the ghosts of abandonment, the constant fear that it would all end suddenly. And even though she was now sitting inside the classroom, she still didn't feel fully welcomed. There was still the pain of being seen as an exception, as a stranger. And even in the midst of progress, there was a shadow that accompanied it. The doubt if, one day, in fact, it would be truly accepted. And it was, at this point in the story, that something unexpected happened. The sound of the bell heralded the beginning of another morning of school, and she, as usual, was already seated in her chair at the back of the room, even before the first students crossed the gate. The notebook, now with several pages filled, with his small, carefully traced handwriting, was always ready. The pencil, worn to the stump, was still sharpened with a stone she had found in the street. Every detail was improvised, but his dedication was absolute. She didn't smile often, but she had already learned to lift her eyes and stare at the blackboard with confidence, and that, in itself, was a victory. But school, although it was a place of knowledge, was not always a safe space. Behind the clean walls and motivational phrases posted in the hallways, there were echoes that hurt more than the silence outside. The muffled laughter during classes, the whispers among his classmates, the looks that ran up and down his body whenever he passed, all that created invisible fissures that, little by little, reminded him of where he came from. And worse, they made him doubt if he really belonged there. The first jokes started shyly. A student blurted out during an art class that the young girl should wear paint on her face, since she shouldn't even have a mirror at home. Another commented near the exit that people like her should go to a different school. And there was also the boy who made a point of purposely dropping her material on the floor, only to laugh when she bent down to gather it, saying that beggars don't need a notebook. She heard everything, each syllable, every laugh. And although she tried to keep her composure, there were nights when she slept crying, hugging her own notebook, as if he were the only true friend. What hurt most was not the mockery itself. It was the certainty that no matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she studied, no matter how much she obeyed all the rules, she would still always be different. The outsider. The one that no one wanted around. But it all came to a head on a cold Friday morning during a collective activity in the courtyard. The school had organized a presentation where each class would make a small performance. Hers was preparing a story about children's rights. The teacher distributed lines and papers, and when it was the girl's turn, she said only that she could help hold the poster. A role without speech, without prominence, without scene. She accepted without question, although inside she felt the weight of exclusion disguised as kindness. On the day of the presentation, all students wore colorful clothes, simple costumes, and props made in art classes. She, in the same old clothes, clean but old, tried to improvise something with a piece of tape found on the living room floor. He held the poster firmly, as if his function was the most important. But between laughter and mean comments, a group of students from the older class decided to provoke. One of them approached when the teacher turned her back, pointed at the girl and said loud enough for the others to hear, "This one didn't even need a costume. She is already dressed as a beggar." The laughter was immediate, cruel, contagious. It echoed among the students like thunder. Some were silent, embarrassed, others just followed the flow of mockery. She froze. The sign trembled in his hands. His face became warm, his eyes watered, and for an instant everything he had built inside, courage, hope, daily effort, collapsed. He couldn't move, nor run away, nor answer. She was there, in front of everyone, being exposed, ridiculed, wounded, in a way that no words could heal. The teacher, upon noticing the situation, intervened quickly, trying to calm the spirits. He pretended that everything was just a silly joke, asked for silence, changed the subject, but it was too late. The wound was already open, and at that moment, something inside the girl gave way. For the first time since he had walked through the school gate, he felt that perhaps he had made a mistake. Maybe I should never have entered. Perhaps the world inside was even more hostile than the one outside. And the pain of that was unbearable. That afternoon, she didn't come home with the same twinkle in her eyes. The pace was slower, the face more faded, and the notebook was forgotten inside the improvised backpack. I felt ashamed, anger, sadness. But most of all, I felt a deep loneliness, as if I had been torn from a place I had begun to love. I was no longer sure if I would return on Monday. I didn't know if I could endure another day of judgmental looks, hurting laughter, and words that bled even without touching. The following night, she remained awake for hours, staring at the roof of the shelter where she slept. The silence inside was broken only by the sounds of the street and memories, the image of the audience laughing, the poster falling out of her hands, the teacher trying to disguise her embarrassment. Everything was repeated in his head like a painful movie. She thought about how much easier it would be to disappear, sneak out, never come back, to listen to classes outside, where at least no one expected her to be the same as the others. But, as she stared at the dark ceiling, something inside her refused to die. A small spark, almost invisible but still burning. It was the memory of every morning that she sat on the sidewalk, even though she didn't know if anyone would notice her. It was the memory of the day when, for the first time, he crossed that gate. It was the director's touch when she reached out. It was the sound of his own voice reading the first words in a low voice. It was everything he had achieved with so much effort, with so much silence, with so much dignity. And as much as the pain of that humiliation was alive and pulsating, there was also one certainty. She had not gotten there by chance. Every step, every tear, every cold night, it had all been part of a struggle she couldn't let go of now. Because even with all the rejections, there was a greater reason that kept her firm. The dream of learning. And in that moment of weakness, it was this dream that held her. The next morning, even before the sun rose, she was already up. She wiped her face on the scarf she kept, tied her hair the way she could, put on the cleanest clothes she had, and picked up the notebook again. It still hurt, yes, I still felt ashamed, but I also knew that if I didn't come back now, I might never come back. And that she could not allow. Because even without knowing it, what awaited her on the other side of that gate was not just another ordinary day. It was the beginning of something that would change everything. That morning, unlike the others, the girl arrived without looking away. There was no sun in the sky, but his eyes had a new light, contained, firm, almost silent, like that of one who, even wounded, refuses to yield. The path to school seemed longer, but his steps did not hesitate. She carried in her hands the patched notebook, the small pencil, and a handful of courage that seemed bigger than herself. She still felt the bitter taste of recent humiliation, but now that taste was mixed with something stronger, the desire to prove that she could be much more than the labels that were imposed on her. As soon as he entered, the corridors were still, empty. The school seemed suspended in time, as if waiting for something. He sat in his usual chair, the last in the row, and waited. Some students arrived later, gave surprised looks, perhaps imagining that she would not have the courage to return. But she was there whole decided, not because he had forgotten the pain, but because he had learned that continuing was his greatest response. That week, something began to change, not in the attitudes of others, but in her. A firmness welled up from within, a determined calm, that even she didn't quite understand, and it was this silent force that began to attract attention. In math classes he answered before his classmates. His notes were complete, detailed. In the essays, he wrote with sincerity and emotion that went beyond grammatical rules. His stories, even with spelling mistakes, had soul. The teachers began to notice, first with curiosity, then with admiration. The girl who had been the target of mockery now emerged as a presence that could no longer be ignored, not because of his features nor because of his clothes, but because of the way he learned. He absorbed everything. It was as if each explanation was a unique opportunity, as if each class was a chance to take a deeper breath. There was a thirst in her eyes that the others did not have. It wasn't just about grades nor about report cards. It was about survival, about proving to herself and to the world that she could. The teachers began to comment among themselves. The new student, the one who entered in an unusual way, demonstrated a rare talent, an intuitive, sharp intelligence loaded with sensitivity. It was more than knowing how to respond. It was knowing how to listen, understand, interpret. And when he offered to help a colleague with reading difficulties, it was not out of vanity. It was out of empathy, because she knew exactly what it was like to be lost, not understanding, afraid to ask. And perhaps that was what impressed the literature professor the most, when she saw her patiently explaining, with simple words and a kind look. It was during this period that the director began to observe her more closely. The same woman who, one day reached out for the first time, now saw from afar the reflection of a choice that had transformed more than one life. She didn't intervene often, but she was there, present, attentive. I saw it in the corridors, through the windows, in the teachers' reports. I realized that that girl, previously invisible, was becoming a reference. And it wasn't just for the good grades. It was because of his posture, his discipline, the way he maintained humility even after everything. He did not ask for prominence, nor did he expect recognition. I just did what I thought was right, to learn and give back. Over time, the principal began to call her more often, sometimes for small talk, sometimes to ask for help with simple tasks. It was as if I was testing something, observing closely, preparing a larger space. And little by little, between one conversation and another, something emerged that the girl never expected. Confidence. That rare, almost unknown feeling that someone believed in her, that someone saw in her more than a number or a past, potential, pathway. These moments, even short, deeply marked the girl. When she left the principal's office, she didn't just leave with words, she left with a burning flame. It was as if, for the first time, someone was not just giving her an opportunity, but betting on her. And that made all the difference. She started to study even more, to arrive earlier, to stay later. His notebook was filled with notes, reflections, hand-drawn schemes. He read borrowed books, asked for extra tasks, researched subjects that were not even part of his series, and even with some colleagues still distant, respect began to impose itself. No one laughed so loudly anymore. No one made fun of the teachers anymore, because now she was seen, recognized, respected, albeit timidly, albeit with reservations. She was no longer the girl on the sidewalk. She was the student who got the best grades, the one who knew how to respond when no one knew, the one who helped without humiliating, the one who listened without interrupting. There was an afternoon when she was called to receive a symbolic certificate of performance. It was a simple role, but for her it represented an entire wall being torn down. When she received the applause of the class, she remained serious, restrained. But inside he cried, not for the role itself, but for everything it represented. It was concrete proof that she was no longer just a shadow at the back of the room. It was someone. That moment marked a quiet but profound turn. From then on, the relationship with the teachers intensified. They began to include her in projects, to invite her to participate in special activities, to trust her. The director, increasingly closer, started to offer books from her own bookshelf. Discreet but symbolic gifts. They talked about subjects that went beyond school, values, choices, future. And in these conversations, the girl began to realize something she had not known until then. She had a voice. And this voice, used wisely, could teach, transform, inspire. What began as an act of compassion, opening a gate for a girl sitting on the sidewalk, had turned into a story of retribution, because now she was not only receiving knowledge, it multiplied it. She was sought out by students from other classes, asking for help to study. She was called to participate in presentations, reading circles, cultural fairs, and even when she felt out of place, because the pain of the past still lived inside her, she remembered where she was, and that was enough. The girl who was once afraid to hold a pencil now wrote poems. The one who barely knew how to read the letters on the blackboard now explained entire paragraphs to colleagues who did not understand. The one who hid at the back of the room was now invited to speak in the front. All this did not erase what he suffered, but it transformed. He converted every pain into a step, every tear in force, every humiliation in fuel. She hadn't become the best student in school just by grades. She had become the best student because no one fought like her, because no one inside knew what it was like to learn on an empty stomach with a wounded heart and with a soul bleeding from silence. And even so, she kept going, persisted, grew, and maybe that's exactly why, in that early afternoon, when the principal called her again to talk, the girl realized that something even bigger was coming. The principal's office was plunged into silence as she entered. The girl walked with restrained steps, but there was something different in her posture. It was not arrogance nor pride, but a kind of serenity that only those who faced a lot too soon carry on their shoulders. The principal indicated the chair with a simple gesture, and she sat down, hugging the notebook as she always did. It was his shield, his flag, his little paper fortress. In the previous days, the school had announced that students could participate in a new edition of the science fair and the writing exhibition, a traditional event that brought together the best works from all classes. For many, it was just one more activity among many, but to her it felt like a portal, an opportunity, a space where he could finally show more than he was capable of, not just for others, but for yourself. It was a way of affirming, with words or experiences, everything he had been building in silence since he stepped there. In that conversation with the director, she received the encouragement she needed to sign up. There was no pressure, just the offer of the possibility. And like everything else in her life, she seized this chance with the determination of someone who doesn't know when or if she will have another one. He returned home that afternoon, with ideas boiling in his head. There was no computer, no books in abundance, but I had the will, observation, and creativity. He had an eye for the details of the world and a heart full of questions. He decided to write. His choice was the essay. He took the proposed theme, the importance of education in social transformation, and let the words flow like never before. He wrote about his own experience without naming names, without telling too many details, but each line was sown with the truth of those who knew exclusion up close. He talked about the power of knowledge, about what it means to be seen, for the first time, about how an old notebook can be more valuable than any treasure when one is hungry to learn. His hands trembled as he wrote, not for fear of making mistakes, but for the intensity of what he felt. When he finished, he took a deep breath. That was not just a text. It was a portrait of the soul. He delivered the work without fanfare. He didn't tell anyone in the class. He continued his routine as always with humility and concentration. While the others talked about movies and new clothes, she thought about the punctuation of a sentence, the impact of a metaphor, the way she could have written it differently. Deep down, I didn't expect to win. I just wish I had tried. I wanted to feel that for the first time I had really competed on an equal footing. The following days were long. The school was in an atmosphere of expectation. Murals were decorated. The works began to be exhibited, and the finalist texts would be read aloud during a special ceremony in the auditorium. She still remembered when she passed outside that auditorium, only hearing the distant echo of the voices, as if listening to a party to which she was never invited. Now, he was in there, sitting among the students, with his text, anonymous until, then ready to be announced. The moment has come. The director took the stage, thanked everyone for their participation, and began reading the 3 finalists of the writing exhibition. The third and second places were announced with lukewarm applause. And then came silence. Her name was clearly stated. A fright ran through his body. It was as if time had stopped for a few seconds. Some colleagues looked at her, confused. Others frowned as if they didn't believe it. But there she was, called to the stage, winning. He got up slowly. His legs trembled. His heart seemed out of rhythm, but there was a new firmness in his steps. He climbed the wooden steps with the same concentration with which he climbed every obstacle in his life. When he received the certificate and a small symbolic trophy, he heard the applause. There were not many nor unanimous, but they were there, and they were real. For the first time, she was applauded not for her story of suffering, but for her talent, for what he had created, for the truth that he managed to transform into words. After the event, she was surprised by an unusual request. A local reporter, invited by the school to cover the event, wanted to interview her. At first he hesitated. He had never spoken to cameras nor exposed his voice in public, but once again he decided to accept. She sat in front of the lens with her usual posture, discreet, restrained, but the first question was enough for the force of her answers to take over the environment. He spoke of the importance of teachers, the impact of the principal, the strength of education. He didn't mention the days on the sidewalk, nor the insults, nor the torn notebooks, but each sentence carried between the lines the mark of everything he had experienced. The interview was published on the school's website and shared by many. Some parents commented, praising the girl. Teachers reposted the video. The repercussions spread quickly through the corridors. And then something she would never have expected began to happen. The treatment changed. The look started to come with respect. The whispers, once laden with mockery, now came with curiosity. Colleagues approached her to ask how she had written. Something so beautiful. Others wanted to know how she studied. They asked for help. And most impressive of all, they asked for advice. She was still the same. I still wore simple clothes. I still didn't have many belongings. I still walked alone, during breaks. But now there was a recognition that no one could take away. A space conquered not by pity, nor by charity, but by merit, by effort, by truth. It was as if she had climbed an invisible step, one that few could see, but that she felt underfoot. With every step, this award, small in the eyes of many, was for her a medal of belonging, a mark in time that said, "You won today." Not everything, but this chapter did. And that was enough to renew his strength. He continued to study with the same dedication. He helped his colleagues with the same humility, but now he did everything with a new glow, with an energy that came from the certainty that, even coming from where he came from, he could get wherever he wanted. He was not looking for trophies. He never sought. But that moment had planted something inside her, a discreet but unshakable certainty, the certainty that no one could say that she was less anymore. Neither the laughter, nor the jokes, nor the looks of disdain could erase what she herself had built. It was just the beginning, but a beginning unlike any other, one that began finally with his name said out loud, one that made her look ahead. With her feet on the ground, her heart warmed, and an immense desire to continue. The recognition of that award didn't just bring applause, it brought subtle changes that little by little reconfigured everything around her. Changes that did not come with fanfare, but that were felt like a silent wind pushing the sails of a boat that once seemed adrift. The girl who for so long was just a silhouette at the back of the room or a figure leaning against the school wall was now someone that everyone began to notice with different eyes. There was respect where there was contempt before, and there was listening where before there was only silence. The director, who had been following her trajectory since the first day she found her sitting on the sidewalk, knew that this was the right time to take the next step. She had closely observed the daily effort, the sharp intelligence, and above all, the generosity with which this girl faced each challenge. Behind all the pain and all the shyness, there was a rare soul, one of those who, when given the right chance, not only flourish, they transform everything around them. It was during any morning, apparently like all the others, that the news arrived. The principal called her back to her office. The girl went as always with the notebook on her chest and her eyes attentive, but this time there was a different glow on the other side of the table. The proposal was clear but unbelievable. the school had managed, with the support of a group of former students and partners of the institution, to offer her a permanent full scholarship, not just for studies, but for life. It included school, supplies, uniforms, food, and even psychological support, and more, a new home, a safe place where I could sleep, eat, study, grow. It took her a while to understand what it all meant. Her mind tried to keep up with every detail, but her heart beat so hard that she almost left no room to process it all at once. For so long, accustomed to losing, to settling for crumbs, now she needed to learn to receive, and that for those who have always lived on the edge can be more difficult than it seems. But there was there in that silent invitation a clear message. You deserve it, not out of pity, but because he built this path with his own feet. The new home was simple but charming. A room just for her, with a bed, closet, desk. A small but welcoming environment in a foster home coordinated by one of the institutions linked to the school. There, other girls also lived in similar situations. For the first time in a long time, she was able to sleep without fear, take a hot shower, without running, store her belongings without fear of them disappearing. There was a place where it could just be, where his body rested and his mind finally opened to the future more lightly. Psychological support was another gift that transformed her life. Contrary to what many people think, strength does not mean the absence of pain, and she had old pains buried so deep that she could hardly name it. The loss of her parents, the abandonment, the rejections, the words that were marked on her skin like invisible scars. The therapist, patient and sensitive, was carefully untying the knots. And little by little the girl began to understand that she no longer had to carry everything alone, that there was room for healing, that the past was part of her, but it was not her sentence. At school things have also changed. With the security of a home and the emotional support she now received, her dedication became even more intense. He participated in all activities, helped colleagues with difficulty, read more than ever. The library became his second home, and over time, what was already a natural talent became excellence. His grades exceeded expectations. Teachers began to use it as a reference in the classroom, not only for his performance but for his posture, for his humility, for the sensitivity with which he treated others. And then came the true friends. Not those who approach out of interest or curiosity, but those who see the heart behind appearances. Some students, touched by her story or simply admired by the way she carried herself, began to approach her in a sincere way. A girl from the EY's next class started to share recess with her. A ninth grade boy who had difficulties in Portuguese asked for help to study. And so, without haste and without forcing, she was creating bonds. Small gestures that, for her, had the weight of an entire world. Because more than applause, that was what I wanted most. To belong. With a more structured routine, her dreams began to gain more defined contours. It was no longer just the desire to learn. Now, it was the desire to teach, to give back, to be, for other children like her, what the principal had been in her life. A turning point, an outstretched hand, a bridge. One day I wanted to be on the other side of the room looking at someone who needed courage, and offer that courage with my look, with my listening, with my example. The empathy he received was like a seed that germinated quickly, and the more it flourished, the more she wanted to spread what she had achieved. His trajectory began to be used in internal school activities, conversation circles, meetings with other students. Never as a spectacle, never as a showcase, but as a testimony that a life is not transformed only with good intentions, but with concrete actions, and that sometimes it all starts with someone who decides to stop, listen, and do something different. The gesture of the director back there seemed small, a simple invitation to enter. But now, looking at all that had changed since that day, it was impossible to ignore the real impact. One person's gesture had broken a cycle of abandonment. He had opened a path where before there were only walls. She had transformed an invisible girl into a living reference of overcoming. And the most beautiful thing of all was that, even with all this change, she was still her. The same girl who listened attentively, who wrote passionately, who observed the world in silence and saw beyond appearances. Each new achievement was celebrated with discretion, not out of shame, but out of gratitude. He had learned to value the details. A new notebook, a praised note, a sincere conversation. Everything was lived with intensity, as if it were a rare gift. And it was, because she knew, like few others, what it meant to have nothing. He knew the value of each step taken with his own legs. She knew above all that none of this would have happened if someone hadn't, one day, stopped to see her. Not as a problem, not as a burden, but as someone. And it was exactly with this awareness that she began to dream bigger. Not out of vanity, but out of purpose. I knew that there was still a lot to conquer, many paths to follow, many challenges ahead. But now, with her feet firmly on the ground, her heart strengthened and her eyes turned to the future, she was no longer just the girl who listened to classes outside. She was someone who was beginning, with small but powerful steps, to write a new story, a story that would not be told by anyone but herself. The years passed like the seasons she used to watch through the classroom window. The leaves fell, the days stretched, the hands turned silently as the girl grew up, inside and out. With each stage overcome, with each challenge overcome, a layer of strength and purpose was established in her. What was once survival has become a mission. The thirst for learning, which was born on that sidewalk, now turned into a thirst for teaching. And this desire grew with her, shaping her steps, guiding her choices, feeding the courage of those who knew they needed to go further. He finished elementary school among the best in school. He entered high school with a guaranteed scholarship and exemplary performance. He read everything he could. He studied hard with almost sacred discipline, as if each content learned was a chance to repay everything he had received. She chose the pedagogy course without hesitation, because she already knew that her place in the world was inside a classroom, no longer sitting in the back, but standing in front, guiding other gazes as her one day was guided. He entered the university with the same discreet sparkle in his eyes. At first, his colleagues were surprised by his seriousness, but they were soon enchanted by the depth with which she spoke about the transformative power of education. During graduation, she worked as a monitor, gave tutoring, did internships in public schools and social projects. Everywhere he went, he left a mark. Not because of his loud voice or any vanity, but because of the way he listened to each child, how he welcomed each question, how he transformed each class into a safe space. And whenever he told part of his trajectory, always in a restrained way without sentimentality, he touched something deep in those who listened. It was impossible to listen without being moved, because his story was not just about overcoming, it was about the real impact of when someone chooses to believe. Years later, diploma in hand, and her heart more mature, she returned, not out of nostalgia, not out of vanity, but because I knew that this was the place where it had all begun. That school, which had previously watched her from the sidewalk, now welcomed her through the front doors, but this time as a teacher. The uniform of the employees was now part of his routine. The corridors, once intimidating, were now part of his daily walk. Every corner of the school carried a memory. Each wall told a piece of its history. The first time she entered the classroom as an educator was like crossing an invisible threshold again. Now she no longer needed approval. She already knew who she was. And this certainty was reflected in his way of teaching. He didn't scream, it didn't. He led with gentle firmness, with authority built on empathy. I knew when a child was afraid of making mistakes because he has already felt it. I knew when a student wanted to give up because he had also thought about it before, and it was precisely this baggage that made her a different teacher. Not because of the technique, but because of the experience. By the heart. It was on a spring afternoon when the sun drew long shadows on the floor of the courtyard that the school coordinator invited her to teach a special class for the 5th grade class. It was the end of a project about life stories, and nothing would be more symbolic than telling her own story to those children who, like her one day, still sought meaning in every page of life. He accepted the invitation with humility. He prepared himself as he always did, carefully, truthfully, without embellishments. That day, He entered the room with the same calm step as always, but something hung in the air. The children were waiting, for her with expectation. Some already knew parts of the story, others just heard rumors. When she began to speak, the room fell silent in a special way, not as one who obeys, but as one who listens with his soul. He told about the girl who sat on the sidewalk, about the days when I listened to classes outside, about the director's invitation, about the used notebook, about the writing award, about the new house, about each stage one. Not to boast, but to show that it is possible, that sometimes all someone needs is a chance. The student's eyes filled with tears. Many did not know that stories like that existed outside the books. Some children of families in difficulty saw in it a real hope. Others, accustomed to having it all, were touched by something they had never felt, gratitude for what they have. The emotion in that room was dense, hot, unforgettable. The class ended with silence, and that silence said it all. At the end of the day, a simple ceremony was organized. The school took the opportunity to honor the former principal, the one who had made the simple gesture of stopping and asking the name of a girl on the street. Already retired, she was unable to attend, but a letter was read in his honor. A letter written by the teacher herself, now a woman, now an educator, now a living symbol of transformation. In it he thanked him, with simple words, as always, but loaded with the truth of those who understand, like no one else, what it means to be looked at with humanity. The portrait of the principal was placed on a wall of the school, with a small golden plaque, and next to it another painting, that of the new teacher, not as a symbol of charity but as a testimony that a gesture changes a life, and that one life, when it finds its purpose, can change many others. She returned to the room that end of the day with her heart overflowing. He knew that his journey still had many paths. I knew there would still be obstacles, challenges, tears. But there in that place where it had all begun, with her feet firmly on the ground and her eyes staring straight at the world, she understood, more than ever, that it had all been worth it. And that, somehow, everything was still just beginning. Sometimes all someone needs is to be seen. Is that it? An attentive look, a door ajar, a chance that seemed too small to make a difference. But that changes everything. And looking at this story, perhaps the most sincere question that remains is, what if it were you? How many times in the rush of the day do we pass someone like her, silent, hurried, looking without seeing? If this story touched you in any way, if it awakened something inside, leave the phrase in the comments, "I saw this message." It's our silent way of recognizing that there are things we don't forget. Subscribe to the channel to continue receiving stories that are not just to thrill, they are to remember what really matters. And if you felt this connection so far, leave your like, because sometimes a simple gesture, even a virtual one, also has power. There is a video here on the side that tells a similar story, one of those that warms the chest and makes us rethink a lot of things. Click and stay with me there.